Okay, so have you ever heard that Mark Twain quote about India?
I can't say that I have.
He called India, let me see if I can get it right. He called it the cradle of the human race. The cradle of the human race, a
Mm.
place with, and I quote, the most valuable materials in the history of man.
Wow.
A bit much.
Just a tad grandiose, maybe?
Maybe a bit, but it gets you thinking, right? What would I don't know, like a world-class economist make of India's place in the world today, especially with all this talk of, well, a global slowdown?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And it's actually what we're diving into today.
Exactly. We're going to be tapping into the insights of Raghuram Rajan.
Oh, I like him.
Right. And he's got quite the resume. He was the 23rd governor of the Reserve Bank of India.
That's a big deal.
Huge. And he's also professor at Chicago Booth, so he's got that academic side too.
The best of both worlds.
Totally. But here's the thing. This is the guy who, get this, he predicted the 2008 financial crisis. Yeah. When everyone else was still, celebrating the good times, he was waving a red flag. So we're thinking he might have some pretty interesting perspectives, some eye-opening takes on where the global economy is headed next. And, even more specifically, like, what's India's role in all of this?
Because he's seen it all from the inside. He understands global finance, but he also has a deep understanding of India's economic engine.
Exactly. So let's start with the global economic picture.
Right.
Rajan makes this point, and it's a good one.
Yep.
He says the usual suspect for this slowdown we keep hearing about, the one everyone blames on the world trying to recover from the 2008 crisis.
Right.
He says that explanation is getting a little,
Stale.
yeah, like we're all tired of hearing it.
Right. It's like trying to squeeze more juice out of a lemon that's already bone dry.
Yeah.
I mean, sure, deleveraging was a factor, but it can't be the whole story after all these years.
It's been over a decade, for crying out loud. He brings up Japan.
Okay.
They've been dealing with, really slow growth for decades.
Yeah, the dreaded stagnation.
And Rajan says, and I love this, he says, maybe, just maybe, we're using the wrong tools to measure growth, especially in countries that have aging populations.
That's interesting. So, if your workforce is shrinking, should a stagnant GDP still be, the main indicator of a recession?
Right. Maybe we need to rethink what growth even means in that context,
No.
Adjust the economic barometers a bit.
I like that, the economic barometers.
And this actually connects to another thing that Rajan talks about, another kind of head-scratcher, productivity. We are surrounded by technology. Things are moving so fast,
Warp speed.
But then you look at the productivity numbers and,
Not so warp speed.
yeah, they're pretty dismal.
That's the productivity paradox. It's a real puzzle.
And get this, he has not one, not two, but three possible explanations for it.
Okay, I'm listening. Hit me with them.
First up is something he calls the quality conundrum.
The quality conundrum. Okay.
He says, we're not really factoring in how much better stuff is today compared to, decades ago.
It's true. Take cars, for example. I mean, cars today are basically computers on wheels compared to what they used to be. Our current ways of measuring, they don't really capture those improvements.
Right. It's like we're underestimating the real GDP growth because our tools are stuck in the past.
Our economic measuring sticks are outdated.
Exactly. Okay, then there's what Rajan calls the unseen economy.
The unseen economy.
Okay. So, technology is making a ton of stuff free or, ridiculously cheap.
Think of it, entertainment. Movies, music. We used to pay a lot for all of that. Now it's all streaming services.
And it's way cheaper. Or even free, if you know what I mean.
Exactly. Our lives are objectively better in a lot of ways, but that's not always reflected in, how we traditionally think about economic growth.
It's like our economics haven't quite caught up with reality.
They haven't caught up with how we live now.
Okay. And his third explanation for the whole productivity puzzle.
Let me guess. It's a good one.
It is. So, for ages, we've been told that low interest rates are good for the economy, right?
It stimulates growth. Everyone borrows more, spends more. That's the idea anyway.
Right. But Rajan, he says, hold on a second. Because those low rates might actually be giving an unfair advantage to, the big companies, the ones that are already established. And it kind of screws over the startups, the innovators.
Because they have easier access to all that cheap credit.
Exactly. Right. So instead of getting those big leaps in productivity from new ideas and new businesses, we're stuck with the same old, same old.
It's like we're stifling innovation by accident.
So the question then becomes, how do you fix it? And the obvious answer is, well, more stimulus, right?
Pump more money into the system. That's usually the go-to solution.
Right, that's the playbook. But here's where Rajan throws a curveball. He's not a fan of just throwing more stimulus at the problem blindly.
Interesting. So what does he suggest?
He actually compares stimulus to building a bridge.
A bridge. Okay, I'm intrigued. Explain.
So think of the economy as this like valley. And right now it's in a bit of a dip, right?
Right.
Stimulus, he says, is like building a bridge over that dip. It's helpful in the short term, but it doesn't actually fix the underlying problem.
Because what if the valley is way wider than you initially thought? Or deeper? Your bridge isn't going to do much good then.
Exactly. And his concern is that at a certain point, more stimulus just creates more anxiety, especially with so many countries already drowning in debt.
Right, it's like adding more weight to something that's already about to buckle.
And he's really critical of those like generic spend more approaches. He's not against stimulus itself, but he wants to see targeted investments, He wants a clear path to real results, not just a vague promise of growth.
So it's about moving from helicopter money to laser-focused investment. Instead of hoping for a broad impact, he wants to see strategic spending on projects with clear benefits.
He wants to see returns, tangible outcomes, not just numbers on a spreadsheet. And that leads us to, well, to India.
The heart of the matter.
Exactly. What's interesting is that Rajan is cautiously optimistic about India's economic potential, which I think is a really good place to be.
Cautious optimism, always a good strategy.
He emphasizes that India is definitely on the road to recovery, but it's going to be a slow and steady process.
The tortoise, not the hare.
Exactly. But I can see how maintaining that patience can be a real challenge when you've got, economic data that's all over the map.
Because some indicators are looking good and some aren't.
Yeah, some are not so hot. Like some recent industrial production numbers have been a bit disappointing.
Yeah, I saw those. Not great.
But then you look at things like auto sales
Yeah.
and cement production, those are actually looking really good.
Because those are signs of consumer confidence. People are buying cars and building houses. It suggests that they're feeling good about the future.
Right. So it's a mixed bag, right. But we can't talk about India's economy without addressing the elephant in the room, and that's the banking sector.
Ah, yes. The issue of non-performing loans has been a persistent thorn in India's side. Those loans that are not being repaid as they should be can really clog up the system.
It's been a major headache. And Rajan, to his credit, he doesn't shy away from that. But here's the interesting thing. He sees the cleanup process, as painful as it might be, as absolutely crucial for long-term economic health.
It's like ripping off a bandage.
Yeah.
It's going to sting for a bit, but ultimately it's the best thing for the wound to heal properly.
Exactly. And he says that this, tough love approach will actually help banks lend more effectively in the long run.
Because you're clearing out the bad debt, making room for healthier lending practices.
It's like hitting the reset button, clearing out the cobwebs to make way for a more robust system. But how do you actually get there? How do you achieve that kind of transformation?
Right, because it's one thing to diagnose the problem, it's another thing entirely to fix it.
Well, if you ask Rajan, the answer isn't these big, flashy reforms.
Those grand pronouncements that never quite materialize.
Exactly. He's much more into the, the nuts and bolts of it all. He's all about consistency, focused execution,
Implementation.
It's about setting clear goals and then, actually making sure those goals are met. No more kicking the can down the road.
It's about accountability, transparency, and a relentless focus on tangible results.
100%. It's about empowering those on the ground, the ones who are actually doing the work to get things done. But, before we get too deep into the weeds of implementation, I want to circle back to something Rajan said about India and technology. Remember that Mark Twain quote we started with about India having those most valuable materials?
Yeah, it definitely made me think.
Right. It sounds a little over the top, but is there something to it? And Rajan seems to think that technology could be the key to, unlocking that potential, not just for India, but for everyone.
Right, because he's not just talking about India in isolation. He sees it as part of a much larger global story.
Okay, so break that down for me. What makes India so special in this whole, tech-driven future?
Well, he points to the sheer size of India. You've got this massive population with a huge appetite for everything.
That makes sense. More people, more demand. But how does that translate into, actual technological innovation?
Think of it this way. In India, there's this enormous incentive to find ways to lower costs to make things more efficient.
Because if you can make something even a little bit cheaper or a little bit faster, you're tapping into a market of over 1 billion people.
Exactly. That kind of scale, it creates incredible opportunities for innovation. It's no coincidence that India has become like this global powerhouse for IT and software development.
Right. They've got that entrepreneurial spirit.
Absolutely. And the big question that Rajan poses, the one that really gets you thinking, is this. Could India, with its tech skills and its entrepreneurial drive, could it create solutions that benefit not just India, but the entire world?
Wow. That's a big question. And we're not just talking about like the next billion-dollar app, right? We're talking about things that could really make a difference. Affordable healthcare, better education,
Yeah.
sustainable energy, innovations that could actually like transform lives.
Exactly. Imagine like mobile banking solutions that could help lift millions of people out of poverty,
Mm.
or, telemedicine platforms that can bring quality healthcare to remote villages
It's about taking those technologies that have already made a difference elsewhere and like putting them on hyperspeed.
and making them accessible to everyone. It's about democratizing opportunity.
I like that. Democratizing opportunity. So we've got the quality conundrum, the unseen economy, but what about that third challenge Roshan talked about, the incumbent advantage? The idea that those low interest rates can actually make it harder for new companies to compete.
Right, because the big guys have all the
Ah,
advantages.
So can India overcome that? Can its sheer size and, its hunger for growth, can that be the antidote to this whole incumbent advantage problem?
It's a tough question. But I think what's exciting about India is that it has this unique combination of factors that could allow it to create a different kind of economic landscape, one where innovation can thrive.
So it's not just about following the same old playbook, right?
No, it's about writing a new one.
Where does this all leave us then? What's a takeaway for our listeners, the ones who've been with us this whole time, trying to make sense of this complex economic puzzle?
Well, I think Rajan's insights remind us that even though the global economy can feel like this massive, slow-moving thing, there are always these pockets of dynamism, these places where things are changing rapidly, where innovation is happening.
And he seems to think that India, with its unique blend of scale, skills, and that undeniable entrepreneurial energy, could be one of those places.
A place that doesn't just benefit from global trends, but actually shapes them.
It's a story that hasn't been fully written yet. It's still unfolding.
But Rajan gives us a glimpse of what might be possible. It's an exciting prospect.
It really is. And it all comes back to that core idea. Technology, when it's used effectively, can be a powerful force for progress.
It can change the world.
And Rajan seems to believe that India, with its unique combination of scale, skills, and that incredible entrepreneurial spirit, might just be the place where that potential is fully realized.
It's a bold claim, but one that's hard to dismiss when you look at what's happening on the ground in India today.
So if we rewind a bit, we were talking about Rajan's 3 explanations for that whole productivity paradox.
Right, the quality conundrum, the unseen economy, and the incumbent advantage. We talked about those.
And it got me thinking, how do these like global trends actually play out in a place like India?
Because it's a different context. It's not the same as, say, the US or Europe.
Exactly. So what makes India different?
Well, take the quality conundrum, for example. We've talked about how things are objectively better now, cars, phones, whatever, but our traditional GDP measurements don't capture those improvements very well.
Yeah, it's like trying to use a ruler to measure the volume of a, I don't know, balloon or something. The tools just don't match.
Exactly. But in India, where a huge chunk of the population is just now getting access to these better things for the first time, the impact is even bigger.
Because for them, it's not just a small upgrade. It's like jumping ahead, like a whole generation of technology.
Exactly. And that ties into the unseen economy, too. When things become super cheap, almost free, it totally changes the rules of the game.
Like, how much do we pay for music now compared to, like, 10 years ago? It's crazy.
Right. And in India, that shift to the unseen economy could completely change how people access essential services, things like education and healthcare. Imagine if a smartphone could connect a village to doctors in a big city, or give kids access to world-class teachers.
That could be huge. It's like leveling the playing field, giving everyone a chance.
Exactly. And then there's the incumbent advantage, that idea that low interest rates, while they sound good in theory, can actually stifle innovation.
Because the big companies, they gobble up all the cheap money, right?
And it makes it almost impossible for startups to compete.
But then you look at India, and they have this incredibly vibrant startup scene. So can they, I don't know, can they break the mold?
It's a really interesting question. Can India's entrepreneurial energy be the thing that overcomes that incumbent advantage. It's possible.
So where does this all leave us? What's the takeaway for our listeners who've been with us this whole time, following this deep dive into Rajan's ideas?
Well, I think it reminds us that even though the global economy can feel really, big and slow and kind of set in its ways, there are always these places where the rules are being rewritten.
And Rajan seems to believe that India, with its size, its talent pool, its drive, could be one of those places, a place that doesn't just follow the trends, but actually sets them.
And what's exciting is that this isn't just about economics. It's about the potential for real positive change in the world.
Because if India can figure out how to leverage technology to solve some of its biggest challenges, those solutions could have a ripple effect. They could benefit everyone.
Absolutely. It's a story that's still being written, but it's definitely one worth paying attention to.
It is. And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought. What role will you play in shaping that future? What impacts do you want to have? Because ultimately, it's up to all of us to build a more innovative, more equitable, more sustainable world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.